The streets of 17th century Paris slumber beneath a blanket of darkness. A faint haze lingers above the cobblestones, softening the echo of distant hooves and the rare creak of a wooden cart rolling past shuttered shops. The city, though vast and humming with life during the day, is now hushed, almost reverent in its quietude. But behind a small wooden door, tucked near the Rue Saint-Honoré, someone is already awake. Jacques, a master baker in his mid-50s, with flour forever clinging to his sleeves, blinks sleep from his eyes as he strikes flint to light a single flickering candle. The warm glow dances across rows of wooden shelves stacked with linen-covered dough, patiently rising in the cool air. This is his world, one where time flows differently, not by the clock, but by the rhythm of dough, fire, and sunrise. The bakery is small but full of life, even in these early hours. Wooden beams arch overhead, smoke-stained and sturdy. The scent of yeast and yesterday's bread lingers in the air, comforting and familiar. On the far wall, the great oven waits silently, its stone maw dark for now, but not for long. Jacques works methodically, kneading loaves with care, each motion practiced and slow. He talks to the dough under his breath, as if coaxing it into shape, muttering bits of Latin prayer, superstition, and family secrets passed down for generations. Each loaf holds more than ingredients. It carries a lineage, a craft inherited from a grandfather who once baked in the shadow of Notre Dame. He steps out back, beneath a darkened sky littered with stars, to check the woodpile. The logs, carefully chosen and stacked the night before, are pine and beech, a mix that produces a heat just right for bread crusts that snap but don't shatter. He listens to the silence, the city still breathing in sleep, and offers a quiet blessing. The oven will be lit soon, and with it, the heart of the bakery will begin to beat. As Jacques returns inside, the first flicker of dawn threatens the edges of the night. This in-between moment, where the world hasn't yet awoken but the baker already has, is sacred. It's a silence filled with purpose, with warmth, and with the slow, timeless art of bread. The bakery oven, a great dome structure of ancient brick and soot-blackened stone, was no mere appliance. It was a living thing, Jacques often believed so. With a belly that breathed fire and a temperament all its own, the oven had moods, preferences, and even secrets. At times it groaned like an old man as it warmed. Other times, it sighed with satisfaction when the perfect loaf was pulled from its depths. Before the sun had yet kissed the Paris rooftops, Jacques stood before it like a priest at the altar. He opened its iron mouth and laid in the kindling with reverence. The fire must be coaxed gently, not rushed, not starved. There was a ritual to it, as old as the bread itself. First, the dry twigs, then the split logs, arranged with care. He struck flint again, sending a brief spark that caught the dry tinder. The first flames leapt upward, shy but eager, and within minutes the oven was beginning to glow from within. To an outsider, it was just heat, but to Jacques, this was communion. Every oven had its rhythm, its slow rise to temperature, its hot spots and colder corners. He had long ago learned the quirks of this one. It was hotter on the left side, cooler toward the rear. You could burn a flatbread in minutes if you weren't careful, or end up with pale crusts if you were too timid. It was like working with a dragon, demanding, powerful, and deserving of deep respect. The walls of the oven soaked in the heat slowly, patiently. They needed time to gather it, to hold it, and then radiate it back in a way that would breathe life into dough. Jacques could tell by the way the door's handle felt in his hand whether it was ready. He didn't need a thermometer. He had his fingers, his ears, his nose. There was a scent, yes, a particular warmth in the air that told him the heat was deep enough. Not just surface flames, but a resonance that filled the very stones. When that scent came and the inside glowed a deep golden orange like the heart of an ember, Jacques would take his long-handled peel and begin feeding the bread in. But this chapter of the day wasn't just about fire. It was about timing. Some loaves needed a fierce initial burst of heat to form their crust. Others required gentler conditions. Croissants, though still a century from becoming widespread, were already whispered of in courtly circles and demanded finesse. But today, it would be simple loaves, pain de campagne, perhaps a few pain brioche for the wealthier customers. The oven murmured quietly now, content with its feast of logs, and Jacques smiled. For all the tools in his bakery, the scales, the sacks of flour, the wooden paddles and baskets, it was the oven that held his heart. It was where labor met flame, where craft turned into sustenance. And as the heat built and the first dough rose in its baskets nearby, Jacques knew. The soul of the bakery had awakened. By the time the oven roared at full strength, the dough had finished its slow, sleepy rise. The wooden troughs, dusted with flour, now overflowed with pale mounds that breathed gently with the air of yeast and warmth. The scent was both earthy and sweet, like the breath of the countryside on a morning wind. Jacques dipped his hands into a bowl of water before plunging them into the dough. This was his favorite moment, the first full contact, where his palms met the cool, silky surface. There was something humbling about it. How simple things like water, flour, salt, and air could come together and through touch and patience be transformed into nourishment. He kneaded with a practiced rhythm, pushing the dough down, folding it, rotating it, again and again. The ritual had a music to it, the wet slap of dough against wood, the creak of the bench, the faint crackle of the oven in the background. It was a quiet symphony of the early morning. Each batch had its purpose. The larger loaves were for families, meant to last days. The small rolls were for market sale, or for those who could not afford much. Occasionally, a wealthy client would request an enriched bread, something with milk, honey, even dried fruit. For these, Jacques reserved special ingredients kept tucked away in clay jars high on the shelf. As he worked, his mind wandered in the way it often did. He thought of his childhood, of watching his father at this very bench, his strong arms folding dough just as he did now. He thought of his daughter, still sleeping in the upstairs room, and how she loved to sneak into the bakery for the first warm piece of crust when no one was looking. And he thought of the people who would come through the doors today, the cobbler with his broken boots, the seamstress with her soft hands, the widower who always paid with exact coin and never smiled. They would all leave with bread, yes, but they would also leave with a piece of Jacques' labor, his care, his hidden hopes folded into every crust. Time ticked on, though no clock marked the hour. Jacques relied on instinct, on the changing light through the narrow window, and on the feel of the dough beneath his hands. When it was ready, when it sprang back just enough but still yielded with softness, he cut and shaped it with quiet pride. Round loaves, braided loaves, long batards for slicing. He laid each one on linen cloths to rise again, to find their final breath before the fire. This second rise, the proof, was delicate. Too short and the crumb would be dense. Too long, and the structure would collapse in the oven. Again, instinct ruled. As the bakery began to glow with morning light, Jacques lit a single candle and placed it on the shelf above his workspace. Not for light, but for ritual. His father had done the same. So had his grandfather. The candle marked the transition, from night to day, from preparation to creation. And as the loaves began to rise a second time, breathing quietly like sleeping cats on their cloth beds, Jacques stood for a moment in stillness. Dough, dreams, and daily rituals. This was his life. And he would not trade it for any other. As the city of Paris slowly shook off the last layers of night, the bakery door creaked open for the first time that day. The street outside was still cloaked in a soft fog, the kind that blurred the edges of rooftops and made even the clatter of hooves seem distant. But already, they were coming. Jacques' early regulars, each with their own gait, their own rhythm, their own story. First came Madame Lefebvre, the widow from the Rue du Renard. Her shawl was always tightly wrapped, her eyes always scanning for coins in the corners of her pocket. She bought the same small loaf every morning, nothing more, nothing less. Jacques had started keeping one aside just for her, still warm, wrapped in a linen scrap. She never said thank you, but he always nodded anyway. Next, the young apprentice from the tannery, Julien, with his stained sleeves and sleepy eyes. He would trade a strip of leather for a crusty heel and be gone before anyone saw him. It wasn't quite legal, but it kept his stomach full and Jacques in good shoes. Then came the priest, Père Michel, with his calm voice and the scent of incense clinging to his robes. He always bought 3 loaves, one for the church, one for himself, and one, he said, for God to distribute as he sees fit. Jacques never asked what that meant, but once he saw Père Michel hand the 3rd loaf to a barefoot child in the alley. The bakery filled slowly, the way a bowl fills with rainwater. Quietly, then, all at once. The butcher's wife barged in, asking for 6 rolls and gossip about her neighbor. The chimney sweep left smudges on the counter, but smiled with such warmth Jacques never minded. Even a soldier on leave stepped in one morning, his boots muddy from the northern road, his face lined with weariness. He asked for a roll and sat silently on the step outside, eating with the hunger of a man who hadn't tasted softness in weeks. Jacques served them all. He knew their habits, their needs. Some liked their bread slightly underbaked, softer for the teeth, they said. Others demanded the crust be thick and dark, as though the bread must earn its place at the table. There was no cash register, no display window, just the wooden counter worn smooth by decades of elbows, and the shelves behind it stacked with loaves, each one different in its imperfections, its character. Bread, Jacques always believed, should not be identical. People weren't. As the bell above the door rang for the 50th time that morning, Jacques stole a moment to glance out the window. The city was waking now, fully awake. Paris was stretching its limbs, shaking off dreams and stepping into the day. And here he was, at the center of it all. Not a nobleman, not a scholar, not even a merchant, just a baker. But one whose bread would find its way to tables rich and poor, to hands tired and hopeful, to mouths in silence and in laughter. He looked at the empty basket where Saturday arrived with a shiver and a bustle. Jacques had barely rubbed the sleep from his eyes when the knocking started, not at the front door, but at the delivery gate in the alley behind the bakery. Market day in 17th century Paris was more than a tradition. It was a storm, a ceremony, and for bakers a challenge worthy of kings. He pulled on his apron, still dusted from the day before, and opened the wooden gate. 2 boys stood there, huffing from the cold, ready to carry crates of bread to the stalls. Behind them, a cart waited, its wheels already dusted with mud from the waking streets. "Gentle," Jacques reminded them. "The rye loaves are for Madame Bouchon. She pays extra for shape." They nodded, already loading. The scent of fresh bread followed every step they took, drawing early noses from behind shutters, teasing cats and crows alike. Back inside, Jacques oversaw the last batches for the stall. He moved with intensity, but never panic. There was no time for errors, no second chances on market day. Every loaf had to be perfect, or near enough. He checked the scoring on each round of pain de campagne, dusted the tops of rolls with poppy seed, and dabbed a bit of water on the crusts to keep them shining under the morning sun. By the time the church bells rang 7 times, he was at the marketplace, his stall nestled between the cheesemonger and the pickle vendor. The air buzzed with calls, bartering, greetings in half-shouted French. Cloth canopies fluttered overhead like flags of feasting nations. "Boulanger," a woman called. "You've brought the olive loaves, haven't you?" "I saved 2 for you," Jacques smiled, sliding them from under a linen cloth. Nearby, children tugged at skirts for sweets, and a drummer in a tricorn hat pounded out a cheerful rhythm as pickpockets weaved through the crowd like dancers. Jacques kept one eye on the purse tied to his belt. Market day was also where stories changed hands. As coins clinked into his basket, he heard that a nobleman's cook had run off with a gardener, that the wine merchant's daughter was seen speaking to a Protestant twice, that a strange illness had taken hold near the riverbank. "That bread," said one old man darkly, "might be taxed again soon." Jacques listened. He always listened. He knew bread was food, but it was also politics. Price it wrong, and you could spark a riot. Burn a batch, and you'd face more than complaints. You might find yourself at the mercy of angry stomachs and short tempers. Midday brought a lull, a brief pause in the flood of feet and voices. Jacques sat behind his stall, chewing on the end of a crust and letting his thoughts wander. He thought of his mother, who once ran the stall beside his father. Of the first time he stood behind this table as a boy, hands shaking. Of how, now, regulars nodded at him like an old friend. He felt, in that quiet moment, a strange pride. His bread fed the city. Not all of it, perhaps, but enough. And though he would never be known in the salons of the elite or written about in the pamphlets of Parisian scribes, he mattered. He mattered in flour and fire and folded dough. By late afternoon, the baskets were nearly empty. The final loaf, a slightly misshapen rye, was bought by a soldier who winked and tossed a copper extra into Jacques' hand. "For the taste," he said, "and for the smell of home." Jacques packed up in silence, heart full. Market day was done. The smell of smoke hung thick in the early evening air, not from disaster, but from routine. The hearth was alive again, its coals glowing beneath the last heat of the baking day. For Jacques, the hours after market day were not a rest, but a quiet descent into memory. He stood by the cooling rack, wiping flour from his hands, watching as the loaves settled like sleeping children. Outside, the Paris streets softened into candlelight and murmured voices, the city exhaling after a long day. Jacques' home was above the bakery. The climb was steep and narrow, with stairs that groaned with every step. As he reached the top, he paused by the small wooden shelf on the landing. It held three things: a faded portrait of his mother, a brass candle holder, and a child's clay medallion, a lumpy sun pressed by tiny hands long ago. Inside, the apartment was modest: a table, 2 chairs, a cot by the window. But tonight, it would be full. Every Saturday, after the market, Jacques' sisters came, and with them came laughter. He barely had time to place the last loaf on the table before the door opened. Marie swept in first, cheeks red from the wind, arms full of linens and stories. Behind her, Colette followed, slower, older, her eyes sharp and amused. "Jacques," Colette said, kissing his cheek, "you smell like 20 kinds of bread and 2 kinds of trouble." "And you," he replied, "smell like gossip." They unpacked quickly. A bottle of wine appeared, 2 wedges of cheese, a jar of fig jam, and a bag of roasted chestnuts. They feasted on leftovers, croissants that hadn't sold, brioche that had browned a little too much. Marie talked of her children, their schooling, their foolishness. Colette spoke of the neighbor's scandal. "Did I tell you the butcher's wife ran off with the candle maker?" Jacques only listened, content. But eventually the talk turned to their parents. "Papa would have been proud," Marie said, tearing a piece of bread. "You've kept it going." "He would have scolded Jacques for being soft on the taxman," Colette added. They all laughed, but their eyes lingered. The bakery had been their father's, before him, their grandfather's. A tiny kingdom ruled not with gold, but with grain and fire. Jacques turned the old clay medallion over in his hand. He remembered the day he gave it to his mother, how she had placed it on that shelf and never moved it. A crooked sun made by a flower-covered boy thinking he was an artist. Later, as the sisters departed, hugs were exchanged with tired affection. Marie warned him to rest. Colette said, "Don't burn down the bakery. Not yet." Left alone, Jacques cleaned. He moved slowly, brushing crumbs from the table, folding linen, preparing dough for the morning. Always preparing. The fire downstairs still glowed. He sat beside it, candle in hand, and let silence return. Through the walls, the city breathed its own rhythm. The hooves of a passing horse, the whistle of a constable, laughter from a nearby tavern. Flour, fire, and family. That was his life. That was the recipe. And in that quiet moment, Jacques felt full, not just from bread, but from something warmer, heavier, and far more lasting. The trouble began on a damp Thursday morning. Paris wore its usual gray coat of drizzle, and the air was thick with the scent of wet cobblestones, boiled cabbage, and chimney soot. Jacques had been up since 3, kneading dough in silence, while the wind rattled the bakery shutters like impatient customers. But something was off. The yeast had risen strangely, too quickly, too unevenly. The texture of the dough felt wrong, like it resisted his hands instead of yielding to them. He blamed the humidity, or perhaps an over-warm hearth. He adjusted as best he could, moving instinctively, trusting years of rhythm. Still, when the loaves came out of the oven, the color was wrong. Not golden, not even brown. Black. Not entirely, but enough. The crusts were scorched, the bottoms hardened like stone. Jacques stared at them, heart sinking. Every baker had a bad batch now and then, but this wasn't one batch. It was nearly all of them. He tasted a slice. Bitter, dry, ruined. Customers began arriving by dawn, wrapped in scarves and frustration. Some turned away at the smell. Others bought reluctantly, with narrowed eyes and pursed lips. One old woman, Madame Fournier, spat her bite into the gutter and shouted, "This is ash, not bread." Jacques apologized, offered discounts, even gave away a few loaves for free. But the damage had been done. Word spread fast in Paris, faster than fire. By mid-morning, a rival baker 2 streets over was already boasting of bread not burned by despair. Jacques slumped against the flour sack wall, exhausted and ashamed. Then came the knock. It was young Lucy, the scullery maid from the Hôtel d'Orléans. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her hands hidden in sleeves, and her eyes wide with apology. "Master Jacques," she whispered, "I heard what they're saying in the market. They say your oven is cursed." He laughed despite himself. "Cursed? By what? A ghost with a grudge against croissants." She shook her head. "They say it's the old chimney sweep. You remember? The one who fell inside 20 years ago and broke his legs? They say he swore he'd ruin this place." Jacques rubbed his forehead. Paris was never short on superstitions. Every creak in a floorboard had a story. Still, the tale gave him an idea. That night after locking up, Jacques descended into the oven chamber. It was a tight, dark space beneath the bakery, where the soot clung to stone like old memories. He inspected every brick, every vent. He cleared a blocked flue, dislodged a bird's nest, and cleaned layers of grime from the iron grates. As he worked, he muttered to the walls. "There. You're free now, old ghost. Let me bake in peace." By morning, he fired the oven again, slowly, carefully. As Jacques stood watching the sun rise through the bakery window, he whispered to the oven, "We all have bad days." And the oven, now warm and steady, offered no reply, only the crackle of fire and the promise of better bread. The stars had barely begun their quiet shimmer above the Parisian rooftops when Jacques found himself still at work, sleeves dusted in flour, hands sticky with almond paste. It wasn't bread tonight, it was something different, something delicate, something sweet. Once a month, after the bakery had closed and the last lanterns in the neighborhood dimmed, Jacques indulged in a secret. Not forbidden exactly, but personal. He made marzipan. Not the hard, colorless slabs sold by traveling vendors at winter fairs, but smooth, perfumed confections shaped into tiny fruits, animals, and flowers. Almonds ground by hand, sugar melted just so, rosewater for fragrance, a soft glaze to make them shine. It was an art he'd learned in his youth, during a brief apprenticeship with a pastry cook who'd worked for nobility. That cook had vanished during the Fronde, leaving behind only a notebook of half-legible recipes and a locked spice box. Jacques had kept the recipes, memorized them really, and experimented ever since. Tonight, the marzipan was shaped like tiny pears, apricots, and chestnuts. Some he painted with egg yolk and saffron for color. Others he left pale, dusted in fine sugar. There was no one to see them, no customer to request them. It was for himself, a meditation. But he wasn't alone. From the corner of the room, a soft creak. Jacques turned sharply, heartbeat quick. It was Juliette, his neighbor's daughter, barefoot, cloak over her shoulders, holding a small oil lamp. She had once traded him apples from her family's orchard for yesterday's brioche. Tonight, she stared at the marzipan with awe. "I smelled almonds," she whispered. "I thought perhaps a fire?" He smiled sheepishly. "No fire, just memories." Juliette stepped closer. Her eyes were tired but kind. "May I try one?" He handed her a marzipan apricot. She bit into it, and her expression turned soft. "It tastes like summer," she murmured. For a moment, the silence stretched long and gentle between them. The clamor of Paris was distant, muffled by night and stone. Jacques offered her a seat, and together they shared a small plate of confections, him explaining how each shape was formed, her listening like a student at a storybook reading. "Why don't you sell these?" she asked eventually. He shrugged. "They're too fine, too strange. Bread fills bellies. This is only a dream." "Then maybe," she said, "you should sell dreams." That stayed with Jacques long after she left. He wrapped the remaining marzipan in waxed cloth, storing them in a wooden box carved with vines. Tomorrow, he'd bake his usual rye and wheat. He'd fill orders and sweep the floor. But tonight, just for tonight, the baker was not a tradesman. By the time the sun rose over Rue Saint-Denis, it was already shaping up to be one of those days, humid, crowded, and thick with the scent of animal fat and bread crust. Jacques was pulling his second round of loaves from the oven when he heard the unmistakable sound of argument. No, shouting, from across the street. It was Henri the butcher. And, as always, he was angry about bread. Henri ran a large, blood-spattered stall on the corner. His smoked sausages were famous, his duck-fat rillettes sought after by visiting merchants. But he'd always had a quarrel with Jacques. Not because of bad bread. No, Jacques' loaves were known to be among the best in the quartier. It was because of size. "Too small," Henri bellowed to anyone who'd listen. "His boulas shrink every week, and he dares charge more. A sin against meat." Jacques sighed and wiped his hands on his apron. This again. Years ago, Henri had insisted on trading cuts of veal for bread. At first it was friendly barter, but Henri's expectations grew. He wanted larger loaves, custom shapes, delivery at dawn. Jacques, still recovering from a summer of bad grain, had finally said no. That no had launched a feud worthy of song. Henri began spreading rumors. Jacques used old flour, added chalk, fed mice instead of customers. None of it true, but enough to earn Jacques the occasional sideways glance. This morning, Henri upped the game. He'd planted himself near the bakery and handed out free meat pies to anyone who complained about Jacques' bread. It was theatrical, petty, and oddly effective. By noon, Jacques had sold only half his usual rounds. But Jacques was not without allies. One of them, a widow named Colette who bought his black rye every week, stormed across the street and demanded Henri taste the very loaf he was mocking. Henri refused. Colette smacked him with her handbag. Another ally, the cobbler Etienne, staged a dramatic monologue in Jacques' shop about the poetry of crust. And then came an unexpected moment. Juliette, the neighbor girl, brought Jacques a small wooden sign. She had painted it herself. Bread, it read, made without pettiness. He placed it in the window. People laughed. Some came in just for that. Henri, fuming, eventually stomped away. By dusk, the last loaf was sold, and Jacques sat on the bench outside, exhausted but smiling. The bread war became a favorite neighborhood story. Children reenacted it in alleyways with sticks and stale baguettes. Henri, eventually, found a new feud with the cheese seller, and life went on. Jacques learned something that day. Bread might be humble, but it had the power to rally a whole street, especially when paired with kindness, humor, and maybe a good sign. The bakery at night was a different world. Gone were the noisy footfalls of the morning crowd, the clatter of coin and request. In their place came the steady creak of timber beams, the low hiss of dying embers, and the occasional flutter of a rat nosing for crumbs beneath the stone shelves. Jacques remained alone, perched beside the hearth, oil lamp glowing faintly. It was his favorite time of day, when the ovens cooled and the noise of the world thinned to whispers. Tonight, however, something weighed on him. He reached for a small box hidden in the cupboard behind the flour sacks. Inside were a few scraps of paper, letters, yellowed and smudged. All were from Hélène, the girl he once thought he'd marry. She had written them years ago, when Jacques was still an apprentice in the Latin Quarter, baking under the stern eye of Master Beauchamp. Her letters had been his comfort, soft, affectionate, filled with hope. But Hélène had married a physician from Lyon. Jacques had remained with his ovens. And yet, he kept the letters. Tonight, one fell open on his lap, and his eyes drifted over the words. She had written of a dream, that one day, she and Jacques might open a little shop together. He would bake, she would paint signs and arrange flowers at the windows. They'd have a cat, maybe two. Jacques smiled. The dream had faded, but the warmth of it lingered, like the last heat of the oven. The wind tapped softly at the window shutters. He stood, stretched, and took a crust of rye from the bench. It was too hard for sale, but perfect for dipping in broth. As he ate, he thought of all the stories his walls had heard, of hopeful apprentices, of noble women in disguise buying loaves at dusk, of lovers passing notes hidden inside bread. Bread, he'd come to realize, was not just food. It was memory. It was the unspoken witness to 1,000 quiet dramas. He ran his hand over the flour-dusted counter, then turned down the oil lamp. But before retiring, he did something he hadn't in years. He folded the letters, tucked them in fresh paper, and placed them beneath a loose floorboard, rather than throwing them into the oven ash. Some loves weren't meant to rise again, but they deserved to be kept warm. Not all of Paris's bread began its life in honest sacks. As twilight surrendered to night, and most of the city curled into slumber, certain figures came alive in the labyrinth of alleys behind the Rue des Boulangers. These were not the bakers or their sleepy apprentices, but the shadowy men with cloaks stitched to silence, known only in whispers as les passeurs de farine, the flour smugglers. Grain in 17th century Paris was gold, disguised in burlap. The monarchy regulated its sale, and guilds held jealous control over supply. But when shortages struck, and they often did, an illicit network blossomed like mildew beneath stone. Jacques knew of them, of course. Every baker did. Some turned a blind eye. Some paid bribes. A few even dabbled themselves, driven by desperation or the lure of under-the-table coin. But Jacques, ever stubborn and cautious, kept his dealings above board, mostly. Except that one time. It had been a harsh spring. The Seine had flooded, mills were still, and his usual supplier had vanished without explanation. Flour prices soared. Jacques' shelves were nearly bare. His customers, the washerwomen, the apprentices, the elderly widows who paid in coin or kind, were going hungry. One night, as he extinguished the ovens, a knock came at the back door. Not a rapping, but a rhythmic tap-tap, 3 slow, 1 quick. He paused. He opened the door to find a wiry man with sharp eyes and flour on his boots. No name was given, but a sack was offered. Fine white flour, the sort Jacques hadn't touched in weeks. No questions, the smuggler said. Just a fair trade. Jacques hesitated. His hands twitched. He thought of the law. of the risks, of his customers. He took the sack. The bread that week was remarkable. Soft, golden, rich in scent. His patrons smiled again. One old woman wept. "Bless you, Jacques," she'd said. "My teeth remember how to chew." But with that flour came a heaviness, a sense of being watched. He returned to honest sacks as soon as the mills ran again. Still, on certain nights, Jacques swore he saw cloaked figures passing beneath the moon, disappearing behind the old wine house. And in his dreams, flour was no longer white, but ghostly gray, dusted with secrets. In Paris, secrets baked faster than bread. The Rue des Boulangers was more than a street. It was a stage, and every baker, customer, and courier played a part in its daily drama. As the sun crept over the slate rooftops, gossip rose like steam from morning loaves. Jacques tried to keep his head down. His hands were meant for kneading, not pointing. But even he couldn't escape the ever-turning millstone of neighborhood tales. The widow Delphine, 2 doors down, claimed the baker across the street watered his dough with river water. "That's why his crust is so soggy," she'd mutter, buying 2 baguettes from Jacques instead. The tavern keeper's apprentice whispered of a flour theft gone wrong, with a gendarme's cap found dusted in rye behind the cathedral. But the gossip that stuck to Jacques like melted sugar was about a certain heart-shaped gingerbread. He had first baked them for the feast of Saint Honoré, the patron saint of bakers. Spiced with cinnamon, clove, and a trace of candied orange peel, they were delicate yet rich, shaped by hand with a brass mold gifted by his late mother. He only made them once a year. This year, he noticed a pair of eyes watching from the alley. A girl, no older than 13, dressed in patched skirts. Each morning she stared through the glass, never stepping inside. On the final feast day, Jacques placed a gingerbread heart on the windowsill before dawn. When he returned from the oven, it was gone. But so was the girl. Word spread. "Jacques gives sweets to ghosts," one child giggled. "No, to the baker's lost daughter," another replied, spinning stories with buttered tongues. Jacques said nothing. The truth. That gingerbread heart was for a memory, his younger sister, lost to illness when they were children, who had always loved the smell of cloves. Now, once a year, he offered one in silence. The next year, the gingerbread disappeared again, and again the year after that. Gossip never solved it. But sometimes, kindness doesn't need to be explained. The skies over Paris were not always kind. On this particular summer morning, thunder rolled through the narrow streets long before sunrise. The storm had begun during the night, but now it thrashed in earnest, shaking the shutters of Jacques' modest bakery. Rain tapped angrily on the window panes like impatient customers. Jacques lit the oven as usual, though the coals hissed with moisture. In 17th century Paris, bad weather wasn't just a nuisance, it was ruinous. The baker's greatest enemy wasn't another bakery or a fickle customer, it was dampness. A single humid day could turn perfectly measured dough into sticky, lifeless goo. As the storm rattled on, Jacques examined the batches he had prepared the day before. They were ruined. The yeast had sulked, refusing to rise under the damp blanket of air. The sourdough starter, a living, breathing colony, had turned flat, its once tangy aroma now bitter and weak. He whispered a curse in Latin, then he whispered a prayer. Bakers in those days often kept little charms or tokens near their ovens. A dried sprig of rosemary, a faded ribbon from a child's christening, or a small medallion of Saint Honoré. Not superstition exactly, but habit, tradition, a way of offering something back to the uncertain world. Jacques reached into a tiny cabinet above the oven and pulled out a crumpled paper charm, folded by his father years ago. He laid it beside the fresh batch he began mixing, murmuring under his breath. Outside, the thunder cracked. Inside, he kneaded in silence. An hour passed. Then another. The dough somehow rose. Not fully, Not proudly, but enough. When the first customers arrived, shaking rain from their cloaks and ducking under the awning, the scent of warm bread drifted into the street like a promise kept. Later that night, Jacques stood outside in the puddles and looked at the clearing sky. He said nothing, but gently pressed his palm to the stone wall, as if thanking it for holding firm through the storm. Sometimes, faith was found in flour. The day may have belonged to the crowds, but the night belonged to the baker. Long after the streets quieted and the taverns emptied, Jacques wrapped the warm loaves in linen and loaded them into a creaky wooden cart. Each step echoed in the narrow alleys, his lantern swinging softly like a yellow eye in the dark. In 17th century Paris, most bread was not sold directly from the bakery. It was delivered, quietly, faithfully, to the doorsteps of inns, noble homes, and poor tenements alike. The baker was the invisible thread in the city's daily life, his work done while the world slept. Jacques knew the city at night as few did. He knew where the cobblestones dipped, where stray cats gathered near the butcher's shop, where the night watchmen liked to linger, warming their hands over a shared coal bucket. He knew which homes paid promptly and which paid only when reminded, gently or not. One house, always last on his route, was different. It stood alone near the old wall, surrounded by withered ivy and silence. A small silver bell hung beside the gate, and each night Jacques would ring it once. The door never opened, but the payment was always waiting. A coin tucked in the hollow of a stone, the bread gone by morning. Jacques never asked. The city had many stories. Some were best left untold. Tonight, the moon was full and round, bathing the rooftops in silver. A breeze wandered through the streets, carrying the scent of rosemary and smoke. Somewhere, a lute played faintly behind closed shutters. Jacques stopped at a fountain to rest. He leaned against the stone and took a piece of bread for himself, still warm, its crust golden. He ate slowly, listening to the night. In that stillness, the city felt ancient, dreaming, as if Paris itself were a slumbering giant and he, a humble baker, was the one soul left awake to tend the fire. Then, quietly, he pushed his cart onward, because the night would end soon and dawn would come, and the people of Paris would expect their bread. In the golden haze of early morning, as shutters lifted and vendors arranged their carts, Jacques felt the weight of more than just flour on his shoulders. Today was an inspection day. The market inspector, Monsieur Dupré, was a man of polished boots, stiff collars, and unforgiving silence. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was to recite exact weights, exact prices, or exact penalties. For bakers, he was both feared and necessary. His role? To ensure that the loaves sold matched their declared weight, no more, no less. It was not uncommon for bakers to shave a few ounces here, add flour to stretch the dough there. But if caught, the punishment was swift and humiliating. The city had stocks for thieves, and it had wooden pillories for dishonest bakers. Imagine being locked in a square with your undersized loaves hanging around your neck as passers-by jeered. So Jacques, meticulous as ever, dusted his scales and double-checked every loaf. Still, his hands shook slightly as Dupré entered. The inspector walked through the bakery without a word at first. He touched the oven stones. He examined the flour sacks. He picked up a loaf, weighed it, sniffed it, tapped it, then set it down. "You added rye this week," he finally said. Jacques nodded. "A wise choice," Dupré muttered, before moving to the ledger. For a long while, silence filled the room, except for the scratch of a quill and the distant chime of morning bells. Then, Dupré rose and walked toward the door. No smile, no frown, just a glance. "Good bread," he said. "Be sure to keep it that way." And he was gone. Jacques exhaled, shoulders sinking. He knew other bakers who cheated the scales, who wet their loaves to fake weight, who added chalk or powdered bone. But Jacques, despite the cost, refused. Bread was more than food. It was dignity. It was labor, memory, and promise. To short a loaf was to betray all of it. He returned to the oven, where the next batch was rising slowly. The fire crackled, the scales gleamed, and outside, Paris yawned and stretched into its morning routines, blissfully unaware of the quiet balance between trust and grain behind the bakery's door. The bakery had its rhythms, and within them, young Luke was still learning the steps. He was 14, a lanky boy with more enthusiasm than coordination. For weeks, he'd been waking before dawn, sweeping ash, kneading dough, and fetching water. He asked endless questions, most of them welcomed, some of them exasperating. And though Jacques scolded with his brow furrowed, he never raised his voice. Luke reminded him of himself once. But every baker must earn his scars. That morning, the orders were piling up faster than usual. 3 weddings, a feast at the bishop's house, and a funeral with an appetite. The oven, ancient and temperamental, had to be fed carefully, its fire managed like a moody beast. Jacques gave Luke a task. Turn the loaves once the bell tolls, not before, not after. Luke nodded, eager to prove himself. He stood by the fire, watching. 1 minute early, 2, 3. He thought, just a peek. He opened the iron hatch. A wave of heat lashed out like a serpent. In a blink, his wrist grazed the side of the mouth. An instant hiss of skin and smoke. He stumbled back, teeth clenched, eyes wide. Jacques rushed over. "Let me see." The burn was red and raw, a badge of overconfidence. Jacques didn't scold. He simply guided Luke to the cool basin, poured clean water, and wrapped the arm in linen. "It's not your first," Jacques said quietly, "but it won't be your last either." Luke sat in silence for a while, cradling his arm. The pain was sharp but not unbearable. What truly stung was the failure. Yet when Jacques handed him a small piece of warm bread, crust still crackling, he took it with a nod, a lesson baked into the flesh. By dusk, he was back on his feet, slower now, more watchful. The oven, it turned out, had its own voice. It demanded respect, not fear, not arrogance, just quiet attention. The next morning, Luke rose before Jacques. He stood beside the fire, listening, and the oven, in its own language, approved. Most of Paris slept beneath its heavy quilts, roofs glistening with dew. But behind the bakery's shutters, the world was far from still. Jacques always said, "Some breads can only be born in silence." Midnight baking was different. No church bells, no street cries, just the slow, measured breathing of the city and the occasional scratch of a rat on cobblestone. Inside the bakery, only the soft thud of dough against the table and the sigh of rising steam punctuated the stillness. But this night was not like the others. As Jacques folded dough near the window, he caught sight of something. A flicker of movement in the alley. A shadow with a lantern. Then another. He quietly nudged Luke, who had fallen asleep with his head on a sack of grain. They moved toward the back door, slowly, cautiously. Outside, 2 men stood whispering, cloaks drawn, eyes scanning the street. Smugglers? Thieves? Jacques couldn't be sure, but he knew the look of someone who shouldn't be there. One man handed something small and cloth-wrapped to the other, a bundle. Then they vanished into the shadows, just as silently as they came. Luke whispered, "Should we call the watch?" Jacques shook his head. There's more danger in being noticed than in being curious. It wasn't the first time secrets had brushed against the bakery's walls. During times of famine or unrest, the city's nights often moved like a chessboard, with kings and pawns trading places in the dark. Still, the oven couldn't wait. The loaves wouldn't shape themselves. By the time the sun's first light slipped through the clouds, the alley was empty again. Only footprints in the dirt remained, half faded, like a memory. And on the racks inside, rows of golden loaves, each one unaware that during the night, the bakery had quietly watched the underbelly of a city dream. It began with a whisper, then a grumble, then a roar. The price of flour had crept higher with each passing week. By the time spring arrived, even the thinnest loaves demanded silver many could not spare. At the corner of Rue Saint-Antoine, a widow fainted in line when she was turned away. Her children hadn't eaten in days. Someone shouted. Someone else threw a stone. That was all it took. Jacques had seen it before. He knew how easily hunger dressed itself in rage. He tried to close the bakery doors, but it was too late. A crowd was already surging down the street. Shouts echoed off the stones. "Flour for the poor! No more gilded bread!" The bakery's sign swung violently in the wind as fists pounded the shutters. Inside, Luke cowered near the oven, eyes wide. What do we do? Jacques didn't answer at first. He was watching the flames, thinking. Then he turned. "We do what we've always done. We bake." They worked quickly. No time for measured rises or delicate shaping. Just dough and fire, round loaves, flat loaves, even crusty ends usually thrown to the pigs. Within the hour, the front window opened, and Jacques himself handed out the first loaf. "Take it," he told the girl with ash on her cheeks. "Eat." Others followed. Slowly, the crowd softened, not dissolved, but shifted. Anger bent into hunger again, and hands became outstretched palms instead of fists. The flour ran out by sunset. The streets, though still tense, were quieter now. The bakery's windows were cracked, but standing. And outside, the smell of warm bread lingered like a kind of truce. That night, Jacques sat by the oven longer than usual. Luke asked, "Will they come again?" Jacques nodded. "Always, until the hunger is gone." And the fire burned on, patient, steady, waiting for the next riot, the next dawn, or the next loaf. Years passed, as years do. The bakery on Rue Saint-Antoine aged with the city, its shutters creaking a little more, its walls seasoned by soot, laughter, and the scent of thousands of loaves. Jacques' hair had grayed, just at the temples first, then all at once. Luke, no longer a boy, now worked the oven with a rhythm and care that made Jacques proud, even if he never said it aloud. The bakery had become something of a legend. Old women said its bread cured fevers. Children believed if you whispered a wish into a warm loaf, it might come true. But more than that, the bakery had become a memory in motion, one of the few places in a changing Paris that still smelled like stories. One rainy afternoon, Jacques sat near the window, watching passers-by. A young girl skipped through puddles, a paper-wrapped loaf under her arm. Her mother followed with an umbrella and a grateful smile aimed at the shop. Luke came in from the back, apron dusted in flour. "They say a new bakery opened on the next street," he said. Jacques only nodded. "There's always another oven, but bread tastes different when it remembers where it came from." He looked around the room, at the cracked tile, the iron oven door, the soot-marked beam where he'd scratched the year of his arrival. That evening, as dusk soaked the rooftops in blue and violet, Jacques lit a single lantern and stepped outside. The air smelled like wet stone and baked crust. He didn't say goodbye. There was no need. Paris would remember, even if only in crumbs. "Someday," Jacques continued, "when this place is gone, maybe someone will tell a child about the old man who fed a riot with bread and a steady hand." Luke smiled. "Or the baker who said yeast was more stubborn than kings." And deep in the night, long after the oven had cooled, the bakery still held the warmth of all that had come before. A legacy of flour, fire, and care.